Getting focus right is always important. Now, for the still photographer, it's really just a matter of nailing focus at the moment the shutter is open. Of course, that's not the easiest thing in the world in some cases. However, for the cinematographer, the problem is actually considerably more complex. It's not just a matter of getting the right thing in focus at the right time, but also a matter of making those focus moves in a way that they don't become distracting in and of themselves. Now, I was reminded of the importance of all of this twice recently. Once was thanks to my own gaffe, a camera misconfiguration that I had set up when I was shooting my podcast video on the R5 Mark II announcement, where I was trying to demonstrate a feature found in the R5C, didn't have it set up correctly, and screwed up the ability to demonstrate that. The other instance came certainly not more than a week later when I was watching a video by Emmy Award-winning cinematographer Curran Sheldon entitled 5 Amateur Filmmaking Mistakes I Should Have Learned Sooner. And his number one point was focus hunting, or not having focus hunting. Now, the Hollywood solution to the whole focus problem is simple. Have a skilled person do all the focusing manually. The problem with that, for many of us at least, is that we either can't have or can't afford to have the added crew doing that. As a result, many of us rely on autofocus in most, if not all, of the situations where we shoot in. Sometimes this is simply to help us work in a task-saturated environment or situation, and sometimes it's because we simply can't do the job because we're not behind the camera at all. Kind of like I am right now. So in the next few videos of the EOS R5C tips series, we are going to look at the autofocus system on the camera. We're going to look at what its limitations are and how we can get it to work for us instead of against us. Now, with that in mind, I think the place to start is to familiarize ourselves with the settings related to focus and the autofocus system as they are in the camera's menus. Now, unlike Canon's regular hybrid EOS cameras, there isn't a dedicated menu for the autofocus settings. Instead, the 11 settings that the camera has that control the autofocus system are simply found in the middle of pages 4 and 5, smack dab in the middle of the camera setup menu. However, there are an additional 4 settings that control how your camera or your lens's electronic focus ring works, which are found not with those settings, but over in the system setup menu instead. So to start our overview of the focus settings, we are going to start with those settings found on pages 4 and 5 of the camera setup menu. At the top of page 4, we find the first setting, which is continuous focus. And it has 3 options for us to choose from: enabled, around the AF point, and disabled, which is the default. Now, the way you can think about this is that this is roughly akin to the video servo AF setting that you may be more familiar if you've used Canon's regular EOS hybrid cameras. However, the settings that we have to choose from here are different, and the camera does not operate quite the same way either. Now, put simply, this is a critical setting for getting the most out of your autofocus system, and its operation and use is complex enough that instead of trying to fit that all in this video, I'm going to do a separate video on that, one of our next upcoming videos. Now, next on the list is the autofocus frame thickness setting, and this is a new setting as of firmware 1.0.7.1. There are 3 options here: normal, the default, slightly thick, and thick. Now, as the name implies, this controls the thickness of the border around the autofocus frame. Setting this to a thicker setting will increase the visibility of the AF frame, which can be especially useful when you're working in front of the camera, looking at either a small LCD monitor or the flip-out LCD on the camera itself. In my experience, and I do a lot in front of my camera, as this video shows, I leave my camera set to the slightly thick setting. I find this provides a good balance between visibility when I'm in front of the camera and I'm looking at either a 5-inch monitor or the camera's flip-out LCD, and not being so thick that it is a distraction when I am behind the camera operating. Now, the next setting is simply AF frame. There are 3 options here: large, which is the default, small, and whole area. Though the whole area option will only be available when the continuous AF setting is set to either enabled or disabled. Now this controls how large the autofocus area is that the camera uses to figure out what to focus on. And this is roughly analogous to, say, spot, single point, and full area settings or face plus tracking on a camera like the R5 or its siblings. However, the actual areas that are covered by the autofocus point aren't the same, and things work a little bit differently. Now, generally, I leave my camera set to small, as I find this provides the most precise control over where the camera is focusing without any obvious downsides or problems from that. Next, we have the autofocus frame position setting, and the two options here are either selectable, which is the default, or center frame. Now, when this is set to selectable, the autofocus frame can be positioned anywhere in the image area, or at least anywhere that the autofocus system can cover given the currently used or attached lens. When it's set to centered, the autofocus frame is locked to the center of the image. Now, of course, when you have this set to selectable, the autofocus frame is moved using either the joystick or the touch screen and can be recentered by either hitting the cancel button or pressing straight in on the joystick. Now, the next two settings are autofocus speed and autofocus response, and these two settings control how fast the autofocus system will focus, would be autofocus speed, and how fast it responds to changes in subject position. That would be autofocus response. And this is, of course, for the continuous servo focus operation. These are, of course, another key setting in getting the most out of your camera's AF system, and moreover, they are both settings that you will want to tune on a case-by-case basis. As such, we'll come back to these in a lot more detail in a future video. Now, the final setting on the camera setup for menu page is focus mode. And most of the time, you will find that this setting is disabled, as it performs the same function as the physical autofocus manual focus switch on your lens. However, it will be enabled when an RF or RFS lens that lacks a physical AF/MF switch is attached to the camera. Now we move to the top of the camera setup 5 menu page, and we start with face detection and tracking. In fact, all of the settings on this page have to do with face detection and tracking. And you'll find simply two options here, on and off, which is the default. Now, as the name implies, this setting enables face detection and face tracking. Somewhat confusingly, maybe, this setting only deals with face detection and tracking. The R5C can actually track arbitrary objects. Doing that is a little bit more complicated than what I'm going to do in this video, and I know this sounds a bit like a cop-out, but I will have another video on that because it's a bit more involved of a setup. But when face detection and tracking is enabled, the camera will automatically detect faces, heads, eyes, etc., depending on how it's configured, and track them. Now, additionally, when this is disabled, all of the rest of the settings that deal with face and eye autofocus will be disabled on this page too. Now, when face detection and tracking is enabled, the next setting you'll have access to is the face AF setting. Here you'll find two options: face priority, the default, and face only. This is also an incredibly useful setting to getting smooth, reliable autofocus operation, and quite honestly is one of the biggest features that separates the Cinema EOS camera autofocus system from the standard EOS hybrid camera autofocus system. Now, put simply, this controls whether the autofocus system will focus on anything or only on faces. And in fact, this is another one of those things that's important enough that instead of trying to get into all the details here, we will look at it in a separate video in this mini-series. Now, moving down the list again, we come to eye detection, and its two options are simply on and off, which is the default. Eye detection, as the name implies, causes the camera to search for and focus on an eye instead of a face as a whole. Unfortunately, there are no further options to customize the exact behavior of the R5C's eye detection algorithm. It will select the closest eye if it can detect both eyes, or the only eye if it can detect one. And of course, if the camera cannot detect an eye at all, it will fall back to focusing on the whole face and the potentially head. Now, there are, of course, pros and cons to setting this setting to on or off, depending on the situation. For example, if you're shooting very close up with a shallow aperture, you may want the eye to be tracked and focused on. Otherwise, you probably will want the head to be focused on. In any event, we will go into these details in much more detail in a future video as well. Now, the final autofocus option in the camera setup page is the head detection mode. And here you'll find two settings: detect from face/head and detect from face, the latter being the default. Detect from face will cause the camera to only start detecting when it detects a face. That is, if somebody walks into the scene or facing away from the camera, it will not initially detect them. However, if somebody who has already been detected turns around while they are still being tracked, then it will continue to track them. Now, detect from face and head will cause the camera to detect a head, whether it is facing towards or away from the camera. Again, if they turn around after they've been selected and are being tracked, the camera will continue to track them in that orientation. Now, the other four focus-related settings on the R5C control how the lens's focus ring will behave. We find them on page 5 of the System Setup menu, and they are Focus Ring Operation, Focus Ring Detection, Focus Ring Response, and Focus/Control Ring. Now, I should also note that all of these settings really only apply to focus-by-wire lenses. That is, of course, all of Canon's RF mount lenses, as well as some Canon EF mount lenses, specifically those with STM focusing motors. Now, EF lenses that use USM focusing motors are not affected by this setting, and of course, neither are fully manual lenses, including those like Canon's RF mount cinema lenses. Now, the first of these controls whether the electronic focusing ring found on those EF and RF mount lenses is enabled when the camera is in autofocus mode. That is, essentially, this is full-time manual focusing as you would know it as a still photographer. Now, the options here are either enabled during AF or disabled during AF. This setting is also quite interesting in that its behavior is actually kind of complicated. So if this is set to during or disabled during AF, you can still use the manual focus ring most of the time, just not when the autofocus system is actively focusing or when the autofocus system is locked. However, if the autofocus is just sitting idle and it hasn't focused on something, then the camera will allow you to focus the lens just fine. Conversely, if you have this set to enabled during AF, the autofocus or the manual focus ring will be available basically anytime you need it. Now, personally, I recommend always leaving the setting in the enabled during AF setting, as you can focus it anytime or suspend the AF system with the AF lock and go full manual without having to flip a switch on the lens. Now, the next setting is focus ring direction, and this setting controls the mapping between the focus ring's rotation direction and how the lens focuses, which way makes it focus towards infinity or not. The two options here are normal and reversed. Now, Canon's EF and RF lenses follow the left-hand rule for focusing. That is, if you curl the fingers on your left hand in the direction of the focus ring, or the direction you are turning the focus ring, then your thumb will point in the direction that focus will move. This orientation is also the standard rotation direction for most, if not all, cinema lenses that are on the market, as well as many other brands. Now, that said, there are a few companies that use the right-hand rule for focusing instead. Notably, these include Nikon, Fujifilm, and I believe Tamron as well. Now, if you are used to shooting with Nikon or Fuji cameras and lenses or anything else that uses the right-hand rule, and you find it hard to adapt to the left-hand rule on your Canon cinema camera, then you might want to change this to reversed to get that functionality back. That said, given that manually focused cinema lenses will require you to use the left-hand rule, you might also just want to get used to using the left-hand rule. Now, the third setting here is focus ring response, and this controls how the electronic focus ring's motion is translated into the lens's focusing elements. There are two options here, linked to rotation degree and varies with rotation speed. Linked to rotation degree is the easy one to understand. This makes the lens work essentially like a manual focusing lens did, or a mechanically linked lens did in the past. You turn the ring, it moves the lens elements, and the lens focuses. If you turn the ring faster, it moves the lens faster, but still at the same rate as you are turning the ring. Varies with rotation speed, on the other hand, adjusts the focusing speed based on an acceleration curve attached to the rate you turn the focusing ring. If you turn the ring fast, it will cause the camera to focus much faster than the rate you turn the ring. Likewise, if you turn it very slowly, the camera will focus much slower and more precisely than you would expect. Now, personally, I have my camera set to linked to rotation degree. Now, this is partly because I use a follow focus somewhat regularly, and if you want to be able to repeatedly pull focus between marks with a follow focus, you have to use the linked to rotation degree setting. Otherwise, the speed you turn the focus ring affects how far the lens will actually focus, and eventually the focus will drift away from the marks because you're not actually making the same speed pulls every time. Now, unfortunately, one setting Canon doesn't provide on their cameras is an option to set the rotation degree or distance. In other words, how far around you have to rotate the ring to get the lens to go from minimum to focus to infinity or back. Many other brands, Nikon, Panasonic, I'm sure there's more, have a setting that allow you to say, well, I want this to be 90 degrees, or I want this to be 180 or 300 or whatever. Now, the final setting here is focus and ring / ring control. And this setting applies to RF and RF lenses that lack separate control and focus rings, and instead have to switch between the two of them. Moreover, this applies to those lenses that don't have a physical switch that changes the function of the one ring that they do have. Currently, those lenses include the RFS 10 to 18, the RFS 18 to 45, the RFS 18 to 150, and the RFS 55 to 210. Now, if your lens doesn't require software control over this setting, then this will be disabled and you won't need to choose anything here. Otherwise, the two options are focus and control, where focus causes your lens ring to control lens's focus position, and control causes your lens control ring to control a adjustment or exposure option. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. Now that we know what the settings are and what they do in general, we'll start looking into the specifics of what the R5C's autofocus system can do and how to get the most out of it over the next couple of videos. Now, if you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us by liking and sharing this video. Further, you can support us directly by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.